Inside a Roman home, wealth versus poverty. In ancient Rome, wealthy citizens lived in mansions with heated floors, running water, private libraries, and slave orchestras that played during dinner. Just a few blocks away, poor Romans crammed 10 people into single rooms with no windows, no heating, no plumbing, and barely enough food to survive. The wealth gap was so extreme that rich and poor Romans lived in completely different worlds, like different species occupying the same city. I'm your host, and what you're about to discover will shock you. Roman inequality was so massive that wealthy Romans had more luxuries than most modern people, while poor Romans lived in conditions that would horrify us today. Hit subscribe right now, because this journey through Roman homes will reveal the most extreme wealth inequality in human history, and it might make you rethink everything about ancient civilizations. The tale of two Romes. But here's what makes Roman inequality truly mind-blowing. Rich and poor Romans weren't just financially different. They lived in completely separate realities. The wealthy enjoyed technological luxuries that wouldn't be matched again for over 1,000 years, while the poor suffered in conditions that were worse than medieval peasants would endure centuries later. We're about to tour both worlds, and I'm warning you, the contrast is so extreme it seems impossible that these people shared the same city, the same government, and the same historical moment. Let's start with wealth beyond imagination. Chapter 1. The wealthy Roman villa. Ancient luxury beyond belief. A wealthy Roman's domus wasn't just a house, it was a private kingdom covering acres of land with multiple buildings, private gardens, libraries, workshops, and living quarters for hundreds of slaves and family members. Rich Romans enjoyed central heating through hypercost systems that warmed floors and walls, running water with hot and cold taps, private bathrooms with marble fixtures, and even primitive air conditioning systems using water-cooled air circulation. Wealthy homes featured exotic imported flowers filling courtyards with perfume, fountains creating soothing water sounds, elaborate mosaics covering every surface, and frescoes that transformed walls into artistic masterpieces. Here's what will blow your mind. Wealthy Romans had better plumbing and heating than most Americans had until the 20th century. These weren't primitive people. They were living in technological luxury that modern people would envy. Roman dinner parties featured courses served on gold plates, wines from across the empire, exotic foods like flamingo tongues and peacock brains, while slave orchestras provided live entertainment, and other slaves fanned diners with peacock feathers. The poor Roman apartment. Survival in vertical slums. Poor Romans lived in insulae, multi-story apartment buildings that were essentially vertical slums, where entire families crowded into single rooms measuring just 10 feet by 10 feet, with no heat, no running water, and no sanitation. These buildings reached 6 to 7 stories high, with the poorest people forced to live on upper floors that were reached by rickety wooden ladders and had no structural support, causing frequent deadly collapses. Poor Romans had no kitchens, so they ate cold food or bought hot meals from street vendors using money they barely had. They had no toilets, using public latrines, or just dumping waste out windows onto the streets below. Insulae had no fire safety systems, causing frequent catastrophic blazes that killed hundreds. They had no medical care, no legal protections, and no escape from the crushing poverty that defined every aspect of daily life. Think about this contrast. While wealthy Romans relaxed in heated marble bathrooms, poor Romans were literally throwing their waste out windows because they had no other option. How does this level of inequality even exist in the same society? Chapter 2. A daily routine contrast. Heaven vs. hell. A rich Roman's day began with slaves bringing breakfast in bed, followed by a relaxing bath in their private bathhouse, with perfumed oils and professional masseurs, then selecting from wardrobes full of silk clothing imported from China. Poor Romans woke up on straw mattresses shared with multiple family members, walked down dangerous ladders to use public toilets that cost money they didn't have, then faced another day of desperate searching for work that might provide enough food to survive. Wealthy Romans spent afternoons in their private libraries reading scrolls by famous authors, strolling through manicured gardens with exotic animals, or hosting intellectual discussions with other educated elites. Poor Romans spent every waking hour either working dangerous jobs for starvation wages, begging in the streets, waiting in bread lines for government handouts, or trying to avoid being arrested for crimes they committed out of desperation. Rich Romans ended days with elaborate dinner parties featuring entertainment, fine wines, and delicacies from across the empire. Poor Romans ended days grateful if they'd found enough food to prevent their children from starving. The technology gap. 1,000 years of difference. Wealthy Romans had glass windows that could be opened and closed, oil lamps that provided bright light, mechanical clocks that told precise time, and even primitive steam-powered devices for entertainment and practical use. Poor Romans lived without windows, just holes in walls, used candles they could barely afford, told time by looking at public sundials, and had never seen most of the technological innovations that wealthy Romans took for granted. Rich Romans had private doctors trained in Greek medicine, surgical instruments, imported medicines, and even primitive anesthetics for procedures. Poor Romans had no medical care whatsoever and died from diseases that wealthy Romans could easily cure. Wealthy Romans maintained correspondence networks across the empire, had private libraries with thousands of scrolls, and could read and write in multiple languages. Poor Romans were almost universally illiterate and had no access to information beyond local gossip. Here's what's truly shocking. The technology gap between rich and poor Romans was larger than the gap between modern Americans and medieval peasants. They were living in different technological ages while sharing the same city. Chapter 3. The Food Inequality. Feast First Famine. Rich Romans enjoyed imported delicacies like Chinese silk-wrapped fish, African spices, British oysters, Spanish ham, and wines so expensive that single bottles cost more than poor Romans earned in years. Poor Romans survived on bread, olive oil, and watered wine when they were lucky, often going days without food and watching their children develop diseases from malnutrition, while wealthy Romans threw away leftovers. Wealthy Roman tables featured foods from across the known world: peacock from India, garum fish sauce from Spain, honey from Greece, and fruits from Africa. They literally ate the entire Roman Empire. Poor Romans depended on government bread distributions that provided just enough calories to prevent death, but not enough for health. Missing a bread distribution could mean starvation for entire families. Rich Romans turned meals into theatrical productions with multiple courses, entertainment, and conversation lasting for hours. Poor Romans ate standing in the street, rushing to consume food before someone stronger could steal it. The housing inequality. Palaces versus death traps. Wealthy Roman homes included multiple courtyards with fountains and statues, private temples for family worship, guest quarters for visiting friends, workshops for artistic projects, and even private gladiator training areas. Poor Romans lived in buildings so structurally unsound that landlords refused to rent ground floors because they knew upper stories would eventually collapse and kill the tenants, making investment in lower floors too risky. Rich Romans had private security forces, reinforced doors, and safe rooms for protection. Poor Romans lived in buildings where murder, theft, and assault were daily occurrences, with no legal recourse or protection. Wealthy Romans had private bedrooms, studies, and bathrooms where they could be alone whenever they chose. Poor Romans never experienced privacy, sharing single rooms with multiple families and having every moment of life observed by others. Rich Roman homes were constantly maintained and improved by teams of skilled slaves. Poor Roman buildings were deliberately neglected by landlords, who profited from overcrowding and had no incentive to provide basic safety or comfort. Chapter 5. The Social Mobility Myth. Trapped by birth. Rich Romans passed massive estates to their children along with networks of political connections, business relationships, and cultural advantages that guaranteed continued wealth across generations. Poor Romans had no realistic path to wealth improvement because they couldn't afford education, couldn't make business investments, couldn't buy property, and spent every day focused on immediate survival rather than long-term planning. Roman law heavily favored the wealthy through property rights, contract enforcement, and debt collection that protected rich interests while providing no protections for poor Romans who couldn't afford legal representation. Only wealthy Romans could participate in politics, hold government offices, or influence policy decisions. Poor Romans had no political voice and no mechanism for changing the systems that oppressed them. The psychological impact: different species. Rich Romans saw themselves as naturally superior beings whose wealth proved divine favor and justified their control over society. They viewed poverty as evidence of moral failure rather than systemic inequality. Poor Romans often accepted their conditions as natural and inevitable, lacking the education, information, or examples needed to imagine different social arrangements or challenge existing power structures. Wealthy and poor Romans spoke different versions of Latin, followed different customs, worshipped different gods, and had such different life experiences that they could barely understand each other when they interacted. Rich Romans genuinely couldn't comprehend poor Roman experiences, while poor Romans couldn't imagine the lifestyle possibilities that wealthy Romans took for granted, creating mutual incomprehension across class lines. Chapter 6: The Historical Consequences. Inequality's Price. Roman inequality created constant potential for rebellion, requiring massive military forces and brutal punishments to maintain order, ultimately draining resources that could have been used for productive development. Extreme inequality meant that most Romans couldn't participate in market economy as consumers, limiting economic growth and innovation, while concentrating wealth in non-productive luxury consumption. Wealthy Romans used their resources to buy political influence, creating governance systems that served elite interests rather than promoting general welfare or long-term stability. Final chapter. And there you have it. Roman inequality so extreme that wealthy and poor citizens lived in completely different worlds within the same city. Rich Romans enjoyed technological luxuries that wouldn't be matched for over 1,000 years, while poor Romans suffered in conditions worse than medieval peasants. This wasn't just economic difference, it was the coexistence of different civilizations, different technological ages, and almost different species of humanity sharing the same geographic space. Before we judge Romans too harshly, consider that modern inequality, while not as extreme, follows similar patterns of wealth concentration, social segregation, and systemic advantages that perpetuate class divisions across generations. Which contrasts shocked you the most? The technology gap? The food inequality? The housing differences? Let me know in the comments and tell me what parallels you see between Roman inequality and modern wealth gaps. If you love discovering how historical societies really worked beyond the myths and legends, you absolutely need to subscribe right now. Next week, I'm revealing Roman superstitions so bizarre that even other ancient civilizations thought Romans were crazy. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and remember, understanding historical inequality helps us recognize the patterns and systems that create similar divisions in our own time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter of history.